Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
And I'm Adam, your co-host. And for those of you watching on YouTube, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell so you're notified of any future episodes as they're posted. And if you're listening to our audio podcast, please be sure to subscribe in the podcast player of your choice. We're available on all the major podcast networks.
So we're going to do a little bit of catch up on news because with the holiday season and everything, you might have missed some of these announcements. The first thing I wanted to highlight is a blog post from Alex Meinhardt, who is one of our identity gurus at Microsoft. And the post talks about how the Microsoft Authenticator is becoming phish-resistant. That's a pretty big deal because it doesn't require additional hardware like a FIDO2 security key. Instead, you can just use the Authenticator app on your device. And this was announced at Ignite. We talked about it in our Ignite wrap-up shows, and it will be available in the first half of 2024. I know that's probably a big time frame for most, but it is coming. And the thing that we wanted to highlight is that Entra ID users will be able to register and sign in with a device-bound passkey in Microsoft Authenticator. That's a pretty big deal because the passkey will be bound to your device and will only be that specific device for that passkey. And my assumption is that this will work for all Entra federated applications, so you won't have to save different passkeys like you would like on the personal side. Another piece of news is that the newest version of Microsoft Authenticator for Android is now FIPS 104-3 compliant. The iOS version was already FIPS 140 compliant as of December 2022. And the FIPS 140-3 is a NIST control for Federal Information Processing Standard that every federal organization needs to adhere to for security requirements for the cryptographic modules, so specifically for like MFA. And then there were some more improvements on the certificate-based authentication, specifically for organizations that use PIV and CAC, which are personal identification verification or common access cards. Most of that is going to be government organizations. And some of the telemetry, since Microsoft announced general availability for certificate-based authentication, is that there was an 850% increase in US government usage. There's also some more configurability now within some added capabilities to use certificate strength or use certificate-based authentication with other methods of MFA as a step up. And finally, the last thing I wanted to highlight from the blog is FIDO2 support for iOS and Mac OS. Now, we've had support for the browsers since July 2023, which is pretty cool. And then now you're able to do that within the Microsoft apps within iOS and Mac OS. So using a FIDO2 security key to authenticate as a MFA device within the client apps as well. So some really nice improvements. What are your thoughts on all of that, Adam?
Lots of cool stuff here. First off, love the Authenticator app becoming phish resistant. And instead of doing something proprietary or Microsoft specific, it's based on passkeys, which is an industry standard. Actually, a lot of passkeys came about from Apple, Google, Microsoft working together to create that standard. So I love that it's standards based. I love that it's device bound as opposed to like cloud synchronized. And ultimately, this solves for, it doesn't eliminate, but certainly mitigates the risk of attacks like machine in the middle attacks like Evil Jinx, which we've covered on the show in the past, or any time to where you're trying to intercept, say, access tokens in the middle of an authentication flow by redirecting the user through a transparent proxy. This essentially solves for that. and it eliminates that risk. So that's awesome. Really, really big deal there. So love that. For those that care, 140-FIPS 140-3 compliance is great. I'm not surprised hearing about the adoption of certificate-based authentication in Entra ID. Friend of the show, Matthew Ward, at the time worked for Yubico, and he reported that the moment that went public preview, he had people in government banging down the door asking for help getting that stood up and understanding how to use it and leverage it. So for folks who need it, it's a really, really big deal. And some more capabilities there around using certificate strength or adding in additional factors is really cool as well. Kind of under the radar that, hey, by the way, we've supported FIDO2 on iOS since July 2023. If you use it, I'm sure that's helpful. And then I thought it was interesting as well, not only the public preview support for the Microsoft apps, but there's a little nugget in there that any app that supports the Microsoft Authentication library also would inherit that capability automatically. So identity is one of those things you got to keep pushing forward here. So some great improvements. And then also at the bottom of this blog post, there was a little call out how Microsoft announced the Secure Future initiative. And really, I kind of see it as the 2.0 version of the Trustworthy Computing initiative, if you remember that from 2003 for Windows XP. This is kind of the 2.0 version of that, where the whole company is pivoting around making computing more secure today and tomorrow. And that's in concert with organizations like CISA, who have been giving guidance to organizations like Microsoft and our peers that we need to do a better job of secure by default and secure by design. And so we've talked about several changes on the show recently around auto rollout of conditional access policies and authentication method defaults changing to the most secure method, and some guided enrollment for Authenticator app for people using phone transports. All of that is aligned with that mission of creating defaults that are more secure within Entra ID and making it so that without any admin changes or modifications, you're getting the most secure method of authentication. And that's our North Star with our Secure Future initiative, and it's aligns with CISA's North Star with that secure by design, secure by default principle as well. And I guess we got this far into the show, we should mention both Andy and I do work for Microsoft. We work in our security business in the field. So we're not directly involved with some of this decision making, but we do interface with customers and get to share and explain this news with them a lot of the time. So identity is near and dear to my heart. It's the first thing I ever covered at Microsoft. And all these changes just continue to drive the state of identity forward. And that makes me really happy, because although it's something that is maybe a bit of a tired statement or cliche today, identity is still the control plane. Identity is still the security perimeter. It's that first step. If I can breach identity, everything gets a heck of a lot easier. And so I know it's not always top of mind for security professionals, but it should be. If you have secure identity, you make everything else more secure just by nature of that trickle-down effect.
The next thing I wanted to highlight as some news is QR code phishing. Mm-hmm. Now, QR code phishing has been on the rise, and that's partly due to the increased popularity of the use of QR codes. During the pandemic, a lot of QR codes were being used to eliminate things like physical menus. I'm sure you've gone to a restaurant and there are no physical menus anymore. They ask you to scan a QR code. For better or for worse, I mean, it does eliminate things being touched, but obviously as a security professional, every time I have to scan a QR code, I'm a little leery of it. And now attackers are using QR codes for attacks. They were fairly rare up until about September 2023, and then telemetry that Microsoft saw showed an increase by 23% in 1 week alone. And just last fall, there was just a huge rise in QR code phishing. And it is a unique challenge for security defenders and security tools because that QR code is an image during mail flow and it's unreadable until actually rendered. It also moves away the attack from possibly a well-protected resource like your computer, your company workstation, which has EDR on it, onto a personal device, which may be less secure. There are less companies deploying an EDR or malicious app protection within users' personal devices or corporate devices than there are for like a corporate workstation. Those are usually fairly well protected. And of course, the QR codes can be easily manipulated to redirect a victim to a malicious website or download some malware in the same way that it's been used for years through a URL. It's just putting that URL in a more difficult to detect location in this case. So some stats, we did improve Defender for Office with some new capabilities in order to protect against this. And just as we've deployed it in the last few months, some of these phishing attacks at scale we're now able to see and block. So just some stats to understand how prevalent it actually is. Since we've deployed some protections in Defender for Office, there have been 1.5 QR code phishing in the email body blocked per day from heuristic rules that we've deployed, 3 million QR code phishing emails blocked per day by image detection, and about 100 million unique URLs that are scanned weekly from QR codes, just from the image detection. So that's pretty massive statistics. And then finally, the QR code phishing protection that we've deployed within our email security protects both enterprises and consumers. But what we saw from telemetry was 96% of the phishing affected enterprises alone. So this is mainly an enterprise problem. So a couple of things. How do you protect users from QR code phishing? Number one, we got to educate users. In the same way that we've educated users for many, many years on basic links. Don't click links that you're unfamiliar with. Don't scan a QR code that you're unfamiliar with. It's going to be the same education. The tools are catching up. There's not things that like you can scan over and see the link or anything like that. You have to actually scan it. So one way to do it is just to educate them. And then, of course, phishing training campaigns like the Defender for Office Attack Simulator or whatever phishing training that you have, there should be some additional QR code campaigns that you can launch to test your users. I know that's kind of a Pandora's box of emotions on whether or not campaigns should be part of your security stack, but I still think there is some value in that if you do it in the right way with empathy and not just, hey, you're dumb because you clicked this thing. So that's one way. And then, of course, get an email security gateway, which you already have. If your email security gateway doesn't have a QR code phishing, probably talk to your vendor about it, whoever it is. But Defender for Office did add several things like heuristic rules, the ability to detect a QR code during mail flow, extract that URL metadata, and then check against both internal, external sources of reputation and sandbox detonated if necessary. Some other protections are always still working, like regular mail, sender intelligence, message headers, recipient details, content filtering, and relationships shared between them. And those are all fed into machine learning algorithms, which produce a high quality verdict on whether the URL and the email are bad or not. And then finally, mobile device protection. Like I mentioned, mobile device protection is less prevalent than workstation protection. So deploying something like Defender for Endpoint on iOS and Android devices that have corporate information should be baseline at this point, just like managing the device. And users may not like it, but at the same time, if you have company data on it, it should be protected. And so Defender for Endpoint does protect against QR code phishing and malware downloads on mobile devices. And then other things you can check on are like protections around priority accounts, where you can highlight an account and get additional alerts or protections around it. Folks like your C-suite or legal, HR, IT, those who have important information or have access to important systems. And then you can also review your mail flow rules to see if there's anything that you can add for additional security there. So a lot of good stuff here. Definitely keep an eye out for QR code phishing because it is on the rise.
We definitely felt that from customers sharing with us that this had exploded onto the scene. So those statistics you shared, Andy, about the 23% increase in 1 week alone in September, definitely felt that as customers were talking to us and engaging with us. They were raising the red flag. And it's one of those things, it's hard to build something like that from scratch overnight into a product. The engineering effort to make sure that it operates at scale, which is really important. It can't be too computationally expensive. It has to be efficient. It can't break mail flow or people will lose their minds. There's a very high bar to clear before you can deploy that in production. And so I'd take my hat off to the engineering teams at all different security vendors. I'll credit the Microsoft engineers, but I'm sure engineers at Proofpoint and Cisco and other vendors have worked really hard as well to implement this. It's hard work. And so job well done to all of you who cranked out some serious code that was able to operate at scale. That's really, really difficult to pivot so quickly when an attack grows so exponentially. I think this was almost a perfect storm of you created a lot of comfort and familiarity with how QR codes worked. Andy, you cited the pandemic as being a lot of people's introduction to QR codes. And so even my boomer parent, knows how to pull out a phone and scan a QR code and read a menu or whatever. So it doesn't make it very hard to do it on the PC screen as well. And so that's something to keep in mind is we've essentially trained people to become comfortable with this. And now we're asking them to consider it more carefully. I tie that back to why we always give guidance around more authentication is not more secure. Because if you make people authenticate all of the time, you create a comfort and a familiarity with that. And so when something else asks them to authenticate, they think nothing of it and just plug it in. That is what has happened here. We created comfort and familiarity with it. We moved it to a method for attackers to leverage, and people just accepted it. That's why phishing is usually so effective. So if you ask people to authenticate less, or you use non-password-based methods of authentication like Windows Hello for Business, when something pops up and says, give me your username and password, there's more skepticism. So in this case, we can't make QR codes go away outside of our realm of influence. So instead, we have to educate on that level of suspicion and just extra consideration. And I agree with you, Andy. Basically, the message you land is you treat this just like a strange URL, a strange link. If you don't know the link, you don't click it. If you don't know where the QR code came from, you don't click it. So those are all really good points. The one thing that had never occurred to me until you pointed it out just now was how if I pull out my phone and scan a QR code, that phone may not be managed. It may have no corporate security on it whatsoever. And that's a really interesting pathway into an organization by leveraging untrusted, unmanaged, unaffiliated devices as that first step. And so you talked about the importance of, hey, if you put endpoint protection on your mobile devices, that can really help. Give me just 1 second. So you were saying if you put endpoint protection on your mobile devices, that can really help. And totally agree with that. What I see as the issue here may not so much be the people who are like, yeah, I want my device enrolled. Yeah, I'll take any requirements you put upon me. I'd say the challenge is almost the opposite. It's the people who say, I don't want email on my phone. The hoops you make me jump through are not acceptable to me. I won't do it. And so they can still be on their laptop, reading their email, get a QR code and go, oh, let me pull out my phone. Click. And now, because you have scared them off from accepting some level of protection and configuration, now we have this totally unmanaged thing that might not be a foothold into the network, but can still be used to phish the user, ask them questions, make them put in username and password, whatever. And so the one thing I have always advocated for is, and this goes for anything, if you set the bar so high that no one takes you up on it, you're not meaningfully making a difference. And so, like, this could go for political candidates. If you go for the political candidate that has the purest ideology but is unelectable, what good does that do you? If you set the most strict security standards on your smartphones and your users left and right just say, fine, I'll live without email on my phone, I don't need it that bad, you've missed an opportunity to at least deliver some protection to a wide swath of people. So finding that middle ground of, here is a level of security standards we can live with, but our users will happily, or at least begrudgingly, enroll their devices in, is helpful too. If I'm in an organization where our policies are so strict, nobody has their phones enrolled, nobody has them secured, nobody has secure policies on them, nobody has endpoint protection on them, then this QR code phishing is actually more dangerous than if we had a modest level of protection on all our mobile devices, and we had users accept endpoint protection and this and that. So just something to think about is, I think our goal is to get as many devices enrolled as possible so we can help up the security game on all of them. And there is a balancing act to what your users will accept in order to do that. Email on the phone, I think at one point in time, was this huge carrot. But as people are becoming more self-aware of their own mental health needs and separation of work and life, and especially for people who work from home a lot, they're getting more and more comfortable saying, you know what, I don't really need email on my phone anymore. I'm kind of one of them. I only check webmail anymore. I actually took it off my Outlook app because I just don't like getting notifications. I don't like it being easy to get to. If I really need it, I can go to outlook.office.com and read it. But that's a point for another time. I'm just saying that if you're still operating in this mindset where, well, we're the gatekeeper to email on your phone, a lot of people are saying, yeah, I don't really need email on my phone that bad. And I feel like that is a mindset that has shifted over time. So I'll get off my soapbox on this one, but definitely consider, I think, a really critical point of this, which is to move away from the hardened PC or Mac that you issue your people and actually move the attack vector onto a less hardened device. And so finding that middle ground where we can deliver meaningful security to that device as well and have wide coverage across our org is a really important way to defend against this attack.
A lot of good points there. It just triggered a few thoughts in my head of struggles that I had previously on how to do this, because more so, this is more of a tangent than a counterpoint, but I had issues with getting users to enroll their devices or preventing company data on mobile devices, mainly because it was through a third-party identity provider and not Entra. So with Entra, you have conditional access built in. There's a device management platform built in with Intune, and so you can require a compliant device and it automatically will force someone to enroll their device and become under management. And like Adam was talking about, users are just saying we don't need this. But in a sense, if users don't need email, they may need something else, right? So this is where the thought comes in. If you have Entra federated applications, like any SaaS app, then that can also be conditional access for a compliant device. And that's where my struggle came in, was you could prevent email, right, by using a compliant device. But at an organization that uses something like, say, Okta or Ping, and you federate another SaaS app through that, like, for example, if you're using Dropbox or Box or some other storage or Salesforce, and that's company data that now they're accessing on a mobile device that's not being managed because you haven't triggered conditional access for a compliant device because that app is federated through another identity provider. Now you're allowing access to company data on an unmanaged device. And so that becomes tricky. And, I've obviously, like we both work for Microsoft and we know Microsoft the best, but there are ways to go around that. Like, for example, using the device conditions within Okta, but it's kludgy at best from when I try to deploy it. So my recommendation is take a look at some of these holes, because once you start using a third-party identity provider, as long as you have a valid identity, you give access to that SaaS app regardless. And there's no way to integrate a compliant device in that. So that was a struggle for me in the past. I think identity providers have provided some method of integration, but most identity providers don't have a device management platform. So you have to integrate with something else. And like, say for an instance like Okta, it can integrate with Intune for iOS and Android, but it can't do that for Windows, and it can't do that for Mac. So something to take a look at if you're using things that are not within the Microsoft suite. You may have a more difficult time to protect against this.
It's a really good point, where email is not the only crown jewel for a lot of people when it comes to mobile access. For your salespeople, it might be access to Salesforce on their mobile device. And if you can also gate that behind device management, now you've created that incentive to accept device management in order to gain access to that thing. So that's a really good call out, is considering how you can architect that in your environment. So it's any app that would be of value to your users on the go. You're able to get them to come in and accept some of your controls in order to gain access.
All right, final thing I wanted to talk about are two of my favorite features within the Microsoft security stack that are actually getting deprecated. We dedicated an entire show to Application Guard. There's Application Guard for Edge and then Application Guard for Office. And this is that sandboxed virtual environment where you launch an isolated version of Edge, or you deploy an isolated version of AppGuard for Office within the Office applications, so that any links or downloads or whatnot, like for example for Edge, if you try to download something, you can block it or launch it within the sandbox environment. For links, they launch in an isolated environment that are separated, essentially using the Hyper-V of the operating system to completely separate it in a virtual environment. Well, both of those are going away, probably because they're not getting deployed. It is something that organizations haven't really latched onto. I used to use it all the time for launching like a local version of AppGuard in order to test a malicious URL or something like that, or go to a site and download something. But now you probably have to do it within other means, like a virtual machine that's completely sandboxed off from your other environments. So the documentation within Microsoft has been updated to show that AppGuard for both Office and Edge are getting deprecated. And then the other thing that I used all the time was the evaluation lab for Defender for Endpoint. This was one of the greatest features of Defender for Endpoint. Is one of the unique features where you have the ability to launch evaluation machines that automatically get an IP address to the public, and you have an entire operating system that you can just do stuff in. And there were different campaigns and educations that you can launch within it. You can generate alerts within your own environment that look like real alerts, but they're just part of the evaluation lab. So that's going away. I understand it's probably fairly expensive to run these type of machines and also pay some of the vendors for these attack simulations that are part of it. This was sent out via Message Center. It wasn't announced almost anywhere else. So if you are using it, just understand it is going away in January. And another call out to follow the Message Center, because this is where a lot of new announcements, features, deprecation of current products are going to be announced for customers. So we've talked about it many times. We don't have to beat the dead horse, but M365 admins should be following the Message Center and parse out those announcements.
Like you said, we talked about on this show, Microsoft IT deployed AppGuard for Office for a period of time. So I had that experience and I knew what was going on, but I can understand how it would be confusing because it popped up as a separate icon. So, I'd have my normal PowerPoint icon on my taskbar. A different icon would pop up. It was obviously a very limited experience. Couldn't cut, copy, paste out of it. All good by design. But it wasn't really clearly explained what or why that was happening. And then you could click a button that would take it out of that mode and then go drop it in, the normal non-sandbox version of whatever Office app it was. And it took a while to do. Everything was kind of slow, even on pretty beefy hardware. So it's one of those things I think was hard for users to understand what was happening. It was probably perceived as very disruptive to workflows. And at the end of the day, probably just didn't see wide adoption. Obviously, tremendous security benefit. I think some of that security benefit has been mitigated with things like protected view, has gotten more hardcore and blocks even more things now. And then even non-protected view, we also covered this on the show. Things like macros are disabled by default, even not in protected view. So Office has certainly gotten a lot more secure over time. And so maybe the benefits here didn't necessarily outweigh the drawbacks. And that's the calculus a lot of customers made in not deploying it. So it is a bummer. It was cool tech and certainly was highly secure, but the juice may just not have been worth the squeeze. MDE Evaluation Lab, I will share my anecdotal experience, was that when I had customers who were evaluating MDE and we would make things like the eval lab available to them, they generally wanted to roll their own anyway. And I think there was maybe a skepticism that we were juicing the results and had those systems somehow configured so that MDE would run really well on them. We, of course, were not doing any such thing, but also, not just the skepticism, but the desire to be very hands-on, build it myself, tinker with everything, deploy my image. For whatever reason, whenever I would make this available, most customers would decline and say, we want to do it all ourselves. We want to run it on our hardware, in our environment, with our image, with us having our fingers in everything, so we can truly evaluate it into a way that makes us comfortable with the product. So I think, and again, the plural of anecdote is not data, but obviously the data showed this was not being widely used versus the costs inherent with running it, which were probably pretty significant. So bummed to see this go too. This was definitely cool, but I think I can wrap my head around the why was, it's the same question of why do security professionals love running Android phones when they're inherently less secure? Because they like to tinker. They want to get their hands in everything. They want to be able to change everything. They want to modify everything. And generally iOS turns them off because there's less configurable. There's less that's visible on the surface. I can't see what this is doing or what that's doing. And I think this is kind of that same mindset where it's, I want to do it all myself, so I know exactly how it works. And I get that and I respect that. And I think unfortunately that was part of MDE Eval Lab's decline. Bummed to see all this stuff go, but time marches on and those engineers can get redeployed to new and cool stuff. So excited to see what gets built next.
And that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information as well as the links to the things that we talked about during the show will be in the show notes. Please reach out if you have any comments, questions, or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.